Well, thanks again for taking some time out of your day to join PA Museums for this program. Um, we'll be holding a few more of these lunch and learns throughout the year, so please stay tuned for more of these. This is our first one, and coming right off of their national conference, the American Historical Association has helped us organize today's webinar about Pennsylvania specific data relating to their survey of history teachers about what museums can offer um, in the realm of history education. I will be letting some more folks in as they arrive. Um, so I may look like I'm looking all over the place here for a few minutes at the turn of the hour. Please forgive me if I look like I'm not attentive. We have with us today Whit Barringer from the American Historical Association, who is going to lead um, a loose discussion of the survey results. We do have question and answer in mind for the end of the program, but if there's something you'd like clarified in the moment, please raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll be trying to monitor that as we go. We'd also very much like if you would all keep your microphones muted for the sound quality of all the participants. And again, we appreciate your being here. Whit, anytime you're ready to start, go right ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rusty. Thank you, PA Museums, for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to be here. We just ended our annual conference at the American Historical Association on Monday. So I'm fresh from talking about this with other educators, and there's some more maybe insights or points that have been brought up since then that I can incorporate today. So good timing. Um, I'm gonna share my screen really quickly so we can get started. Oh, let me see here. Hmm. It's not showing me. Interesting. Let me see what I can do here. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of problem with the share function, and I don't think that this has anything to do with the permissions. It's just telling me unknown for everything. Does anybody know how to fix that? Um, Interesting. Okay, let me see what I can do. Fix it out. Sorry, everybody. We thought we had this set up. Um, okay, I'll do this another way then. But while while I'm figuring this out, apologies. Um, I'll go ahead and just get started talking kind of in generalities about the report. Um, so I want to start out by saying that I'm very sensitive to the fact that PA museums, even though you're here as museum employees and educators, you are not all museums about history, right? And this is a report that is about how U.S. history is being taught in schools. But because I'm trying to be sensitive to that. What expertise I have is about history teaching, but I'm hopeful that I have designed a presentation that will have something for all of you. When you're thinking about how do we collaborate with the teachers in our neighboring districts and across the state. Um, I'm opening. I had it in Google Sheets, so now I'm opening it my computer. Oh, it was a privacy issue on my end. I apologize. Here we go. So sorry. Um, so Yes, I am, as Rusty introduced me, I'm Dr. Whit Barringer. I'm at the American Historical Association. I am currently the uh, program and data analyst at the AHA, but I was one of the researchers on the American Lesson Plan. And when PA Museums approached me about having this kind of what we call at the AHA lunch and learns, we are, it was a real opportunity for me to figure out how to talk to museum educators. So I also want to encourage you to give me feedback on, at the end of the presentation, or to email me afterwards with what was helpful for you, and what you would have liked to see in the presentation as well. I don't get the opportunity to talk to museum educators that often, so I'm really excited for this opportunity, and I hope to speak for between 20 and 30 minutes today, and then I want to have it open for Q&A, because I am going to take kind of an overview look at the report and putting Pennsylvania into some context across with what the trends are in history education across the US. And then at the end, I want to kind of crystallize some of the things that I think that are that could be operationalized by museums in response to this report, and the situation on the ground in Pennsylvania. So, um, this is the QR code for the report itself, if you haven't gotten to see it. I will also be giving this PowerPoint to Rusty so that he can send it to the membership, for the people who are here today, if you'd like to have that as a resource. Let's talk about the context for the report, and the kind of key ideas and themes that I want to present today. As I mentioned, Pennsylvania and the national history teaching landscape, but specifically, how is history teaching culture similar or different in Pennsylvania compared to the landscape? And what challenges do Pennsylvania teachers face that are unique in that landscape? And then how can museum educators of all kinds help and collaborate with Pennsylvania teachers? And I'm going to emphasize that collaborate piece, and I'll explain more of what I mean by that as I continue. So, just to give you a little bit of context to understand where the American Lesson Plan kind of emerged from. It was a 2-year project, grant funded, that began in summer of 2022 and ended formally on with the creation or publication of the report on September 18th, 2024. We had a 2-year research period. When we began the project, we went in with an understanding of K-12 history teachers as colleagues, but with demands on them that made them as distinct from academic historians as, say, archivists or public historians, which is to say that we assumed that they have their own professional norms that we need to respect, and that we should not impose our own standards for scholarship and teaching upon them. So we tried to approach teachers and their work carefully, and with a lot of consideration, and tried to be comprehensive wherever possible, because we wanted to very much come away with an understanding rather than, I mean, of course, we develop more questions, but we didn't want to leave questions unanswered if we thought that they were significant. And we discovered many questions as we were working on this report that we then, led to more rabbit holes that we had to go down, which resulted in a 200-page report. And this is where I'll say kind of my first general advice for museum educators is that approaching teachers with respect and treating them as professionals with their own professional norms and what have you. I think, generally speaking, museum educators are going to be fairly respectful of teachers, but there is a national narrative in the United States about the general that teachers are more of an obstacle to learning than they are the facilitators of learning. There is a a narrative, a demoralizing narrative, and very intentionally so, about the quality of teachers today. And there are lots of conversations that we can have about who is teaching U.S. history in the classrooms, whether they approach it as professionals, right? But when we're talking about starting out collaborative relationships on a basis of respect, approaching without assuming what you don't use the information that you've been absorbing from media narratives to inform what you think teachers are doing. Start from hearing from them first. So when this report was kind of generated at the AHA, the fact finding for it began 2 years after the COVID-19 pandemic and 2 years after the George Floyd protests, which are two of the most significant societal events to affect public education and history education in particular since the civil rights movement. COVID-19 opened up schools with online learning and allowed parents to watch over their kids' shoulders and see how, depending on where they were, history had or had not changed since they had been in school. Okay. The killing of George Floyd and the protests and political messaging thereafter made their parents into motivated listeners. Okay. There was a kind of national educational moment that happened after the George Floyd protests. Everybody's trying to absorb information about what's going on. We see the proliferation of, narratives, historical narratives about police brutality, for example. And when I was teaching in 2020, the students that I had that came in fall 2020 were night and day different in their understandings of how the world worked from fall 2019. And that has a lot to do with, I think that speaks to, and also that they were the largest protests in U.S. history, right? This speaks to kind of the gravitational pull of this event and how it pulled people's attention. And depending on kind of the political understandings of those motivated parents who are listening in, that changed how they reacted to what their students were learning. We see the first divisive concepts bill, which is a response to the George Floyd protests, and this kind of attempt to take certain subjects out of the classroom that are seen as dangerous, as enabling school-age children to have complex political opinions. We see kind of this pullback on that kind of content, and really for the there isn't much precedent for legislatures stepping in and telling teachers what they can't teach. German during World War I is an example. And there have been examples around communism during the Cold War, and then in the 2010s with Arizona. But generally speaking, most legislation that has been passed has been to add people to the content, to expand, to make more inclusive the content that teachers are supposed to be teaching. There are not many teeth. There's not many teeth on those laws. It's mostly encouraging people to add African American history, for example. But in recent years, we've seen legislatures become more bold, not only in saying certain content can't be taught, but that certain content has to be taught, and that it has to be taught in the way that the state wants it to be. Connecticut and Washington State are examples of, they've developed curriculum at the state level, which is generally considered something that states don't do, that states don't have official curriculums that they hand down to states. or to districts. But what we've seen is kind of this expanding, this expansion of authority at the state level, and this kind of exercising of that authority to really reach into the classroom and try to change what is being taught. Um, the lion's share of divisive concepts bills have been passed between 2021 and 2023, but I don't want to suggest at all that this is over. We're certainly seeing more bills come to the fore, but K-12 has been the focus previously. It looks like higher ed is going to be more of the focus from here on out. So that may affect, I say here on out, coming up this year. So that may affect museum educators if you're working with, people at the higher ed level, that even in Pennsylvania, where you have a Democratic governor and there is some sort of, there are checks and balances at your state level, essentially, you may see the political pressure ramped up on the people, the communities that you work with in Pennsylvania because of what's going on around. And as you very well know, in Pennsylvania, which is so often the subject of national political attention, that these pressures that are coming to bear on the Pennsylvania context, even if they're not state laws that are changing, right, it can change the context in which you're doing your work. Um, so the AHA investigation into history education in public schools emerges from and is immediately in response to these conflicts and how they created accusations about indoctrination, brainwashing, and various other malicious intents with very little credible evidence, and in some cases where teachers had not changed what they were teaching pre and post pandemic. Um, our team went in assuming that we knew very little, and then we talked to over 200 teachers, collecting nearly 900 laws across all 50 states, and a geographically representative sampling of over 3,000 teachers for a survey. And after all of that, we can say that we learned quite a bit. Um, and just to give you a little bit more context on the American Historical Association, we're the oldest profession for historians in the United States. Um, we have over 10,500 members, as the largest the largest professional historical organization in the world. And it's part of our charter from Congress, to be interested in issues around history education, professional standards, ethics, innovative scholarship and teaching, academic freedom. And we are very interested in just the educational pipeline of how a student learns history from the first moments that they, public history, and K-12 history, and all the way through to the end of their education, and also in public life. Oh, sorry. Okay. Can you still see my screen? Okay, thank you. So let's talk about national and state representation in our work, and specifically about Pennsylvania. Like, how is Pennsylvania represented in what we've done? So Pennsylvania, we looked at 9 particular states when we were working on this project for what we call deep dives. These are the places where we did our interviews, where we put out our survey, and where we paid special attention to digging through laws to kind of understand the regulatory context in which Pennsylvania teachers are doing their work. In our survey, so we collected parameters about, or we collected, or excuse me, I'm looking at the interview page right now, but when I said that we looked at over 200, or we talked to over 200 teachers, we only were able to access about 22 in Pennsylvania out of that total number of 205, which is disproportionately low for its population. In terms of, we were able to interview quite a few more people in Texas and Illinois. And I also want to point out, this is for the survey itself. that 335 of the total 3,012 are from Pennsylvania, which is again a little bit of an underrepresentation. We found it fairly difficult to access Pennsylvania teachers, which may actually mirror some of your experiences. And part of this is because there is no one way that Pennsylvania districts operate. In terms of the broader context that we were interacting with, Pennsylvania was particularly unregulated in terms of when are certain history classes taught? Well, as we'll see in just a second, that Pennsylvania doesn't really provide any sort of requirement for when certain history levels are taught. That said, there are lots of similarities between Pennsylvania and other states. I also wanted to point out this, these figures are all from the American Lesson Plan. So, if you want to take a closer look at that, you can download the report. But I wanted to point out that we had a little bit, so we were able to, we asked teachers how long they had been teaching or how long they had been in education. And you can see that it's a little bit top heavy in terms of there are far more teachers who have taught 11 or more years than there are teachers who taught 10 or fewer years. That's partly because there are fewer teachers coming into the profession, but in particular, Pennsylvania was overrepresented in veteran teachers. So 21 or more years in education, we were more likely to find a veteran teacher in Pennsylvania than we were in other states. So the teacher population, the history teacher population in Pennsylvania is a little bit older, and that has ramifications for how willing teachers are to change. If they've been doing the same thing for a really long time, they're going to be very hesitant to introduce new content or rewrite their lessons. And this is, again, let me emphasize, where you should be collaborating with teachers in these contexts, because they will know exactly what they need. They will know exactly where they need supplemental instruction, or where a site visit would be particularly helpful, right? So in Pennsylvania in particular, it is very important to have a one-on-one relationship with the districts that you're working with and the teachers and the administrators. Because in other states where there's more kind of consolidated control in the administration, you're going to see you'd be able to provide, say, PD to several districts at once because they're all aligning to each other. Whereas in Pennsylvania, it's just going to be district by district and often classroom by classroom what content is being offered. So I want to also talk about kind of the accountability movement, which is you've heard about when No Child Left Behind came around in the early 2000s, and this kind of push for this federal level accountability. Well, previously that's kind of like the headline federal legislation, but previously the accountability movement had been at work at states trying to create more tests for students, to standardize how certain subjects are taught. And this isn't an attempt to create better schools, right? This idea that if we know what everybody's teaching and we test everybody, and then we can see through the test if the teaching is successful. This has often become more of a cudgel against teachers and particular schools than it kind of individualizes the it makes individual to the district whatever failings are happening, rather than kind of diagnosing systemically if there's an issue, right? So a poorer school who gets a test and they don't do as well as a wealthier school, the way that the system works is to say, well, that poor school is failing, and usually some sort of punitive measure for that poorer school, while the richer school who made better scores can, get rewarded for having better test scores, which actually increases that divide. So that's kind of how we see it commonly used. And there have been lots of critiques of that. Pennsylvania in particular has a very uneven accountability kind of structure. They've been trying to create a keystone exam for US history for years now and have not, like, over 10 years it's been on the books and it has not actually materialized. And that's partly because the way that federal funding works for education is that there's much more emphasis, and state funding, there's much more emphasis on ELA literacy and math. And ultimately, what that means is that in elementary school, um, students are not getting social studies. They're getting ELA and math and very little of anything else. There's quite a lot of boosterism for science. And even science has trouble breaking into those elementary school classrooms because of how much time is disproportionately put on ELA and math. And this has only increased since the pandemic and since since evidence emerged of learning loss, right? And we have students who were, um, uh, you know, well, actually, there was a survey recently that 54% of adults between the ages of 17 and 74 cannot read at a sixth grade level. And so this is, as the accountability structure um, is is in a post-pandemic situation, it's not going to be able to diagnose systemically what's going on. It's still going to individualize kind of the punishments and the blame and responsibility for those perceived failures. But even though the accountability movement has unevenly touched Pennsylvania, especially in terms of U.S. history, Pennsylvania teachers are still in similarly normed, standardized compared to other teachers across the United States. Um, you could say that the 20th century is a story of standardization, trying to in fits and starts, trying to balance local authority with control and oversight. And where does teacher autonomy lie in that mix? And so far in Pennsylvania, U.S. teachers have a relatively shielded or relatively untouched position where they get to teach what they want, but it's something it's the silver lining to neglect in that U.S. history is very much neglected across Pennsylvania. Very rarely only in the bigger districts do you see, say, social studies curriculum coordinators, people who are there to try and help and supplement and support teachers in the classroom. Very often in Pennsylvania, teachers are on their own. Um, and that's a common position in general, to have like not a lot of attention paid to social studies, but it's interesting for Pennsylvania because of its size, that there's not as much oversight for social studies at the state level. In comparable states, they have a state social studies person, and in Pennsylvania, I believe it's just a social studies consultant, and not like a necessarily a permanent position. The other subjects, primarily math and ELA and science, get a boost from granting, gifting, and fundraising patterns, but history so far has been left behind. And so what we see is that social studies, ideally, students would get at least 45 minutes of social studies a day in the elementary grades. We're lucky if students get 30 minutes of social studies a week. And that was often reported in Pennsylvania. And the result of that is students who get into middle school and get into their eighth grade history class and don't know how to read a map, or have never learned all of the states in the United States, for example. So there are just like these fundamental ways that museum educators, you are operating with this assumption that by this age, what is age appropriate, right? Well, at this age, they should be able to do X, Y, and Z. Well, we really can't assume that anymore because of how uneven, and particularly again in Pennsylvania, that there is no predictability from one district to the next. So I think that this is a key moment where you need to be reconnecting with social studies teachers, with teachers in general, because social studies is just one of many subjects that has been radically altered or has having to respond to radically different circumstances since the pandemic. Um, yeah, reconnecting and making sure that you're not assuming what students know, like, actually running your material by for the particular age groups that you're producing your material, making sure that teachers are involved and can give you feedback on what their students know and what they don't. And I will also say, if you're hoping to wait out the kind of learning loss from the pandemic, there's probably at least another 10 years of pandemic affected learning loss that we're going to be facing. And then after that point, who knows what education is going to look like, right? So we are all settling in for the long haul of teaching and public education, but this is all going to be harder because we're starting from the likelihood that they're going to meet you halfway is less now. Um, so timeline, this is a timeline of social studies standards adoption by state. If you look in the report in part one, there's a massive history of education there that for particularly of history education, and the accountability movement that came out of the 1980s after the report A Nation at Risk, which was a huge wake-up call for the federal government and for education investment and the design of our education systems, and kind of led to this centralization. And I say wake-up call in that there are critiques of how A Nation at Risk assessed what it saw as the issues in American education across the board, right? But those came later, and they came with a much quieter voice. When A Nation at Risk kind of came on the scene, the response was standardization. And so you could see that Pennsylvania was one of the later states under 2002 to develop standards. And the most recent standards, I forgot to look, but they're not they are not from the last decade. They are quite old comparatively to other states where they revise on a cycle much more quickly than Pennsylvania does. And so this is an example of the scope and sequence. The scope meaning what is being taught within a certain class, and then the sequence of what is being taught in what order, right? And you can see here that we looked at state history, and also first half, second half, first half being generally from the beginning of the US or beginning of colonization in the Americas to 1877. And then second half usually is post 1877. You can see down here, Pennsylvania, it's pink all the way across because it's state and national history throughout in their standards. It's very vague. And even the way that the history is divided, it is not first half, second half. It is based on Pennsylvania history rather than a national history, which makes it an outlier in terms of what the national landscape looks like. So again, I'm again emphasizing the context that you're in matters, and there are going to be incredibly unique local variations on what is being taught where you are. But that said, Pennsylvania, when we talk to teachers, there may have been some differences. You can see that in most states, people are learning first half history in fifth and eighth grade, and in most states, they have a second half history class when they're in high school. And more or less, the teachers that we talked to in Pennsylvania followed that model. There were some variations, say US history in sixth grade rather than fifth grade, right? But so, simultaneously, while there's this kind of when we were doing research on Pennsylvania, we sometimes called it the Wild West because we just didn't know what we were going to find when whoever we talked to. But in general, there was some sort of alignment, and that's partly because there is a national teaching culture of history. And that national teaching culture comes from um, pre-service education, so what they're learning in their US history classes, which is when they're if they're doing a subject matter major for education. So in most US introductory courses that those teachers would be taking are generally around the same subject areas that I was talking about. First half and second half are very much still alive in grad school education. Um, sorry, I was just trying to look at the time. But so pre-service education, generational mentoring in K-12 history departments. So the older teacher giving their materials to the younger teacher who's over their head, right? And that perpetuating how history is taught in a certain way with a certain accent, right? Or dialect in that local area. Um, Professional learning community, so teachers norming each other, like meeting to talk about the curriculum and where they're teaching and trying to keep each other on the same pace. Increasingly dedicated curriculum specialists, professional associations like the NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies, of which there is a Pennsylvania chapter, of course, Pennsylvania Council for the Social Studies. And Pennsylvania is also a member of the Middle States Council for the Social Studies. And I really encourage you to join these organizations and go to those sessions to understand the environments that the teachers locally are teaching in, and to kind of hear multiple experiences at once. I've been to the Pennsylvania Council for the Social Studies, and going from room to room, I got to hear things that I was hearing in interviews, but I also got to hear more context, right? And I got to hear more of it at once, and so I got a much more textured understanding of what teaching is like in Pennsylvania now. Um, so I also want to point out that teachers generally report using their state standards, and over half of teachers say that they use a hard copy of a U.S. history book to teach U.S. history. But I'm skipping ahead, sorry. But do I have it? Apologies. I was going to say that Pennsylvania is even lower on the state's curriculum and framework standards. The Pennsylvania answered at much lower rates that they use their state standards because there's no impetus to. If there's no testing, the standards themselves are vague. Like, it encourages people to riff on those standards rather than kind of obey them as they might in, say, Alabama, where they have incredibly detailed content standards. And if you're interested in understanding what a different approach looks like, I would suggest looking at Massachusetts. Their standards are kind of more question based. So there's less content in them, but they encourage teachers to ask certain questions of their students. And then there's Alabama, which very much detailed, goes line by line and says these are the things that you need to be teaching your students. Um, I want to leave time to kind of discuss. Um, so I want to skip ahead a little bit. Here's another example. A common assessment every unit just means, are you aligned with your other teachers? Do you feel like, are you giving the same tests to test for comprehension? And you can see that Pennsylvania is near the bottom, and that what that says, even though there is evidence that Pennsylvania teachers are working with each other, everybody's able to march through their own drummer a little bit more in Pennsylvania. Um, and I wanted to show you this. Pennsylvania very much lines up with this. This is a kind of an overall graph, but what you can see here is we asked teachers, what are the high priorities for coverage in your classrooms? And you can see that the American Revolution and the founding of the Republic was 79% of teachers saying that it was it was important or very important. Slavery in the antebellum South, the Great Depression and the New Deal, World War II, and then we get to the Civil Rights Movement. And these are all areas that are very strong with U.S. teachers, or excuse me, with U.S. history teachers in Pennsylvania. But what I want to point you to is where they are feeling like it's less important, and that it's harder for them to cover. So up here with Native America before European colonization, 24%, which is a rich history in Pennsylvania and something that is worth tapping into to help teachers. Generally, teachers are scared of saying the wrong things or not understanding the terminology when we're talking about Native America, and also with LGBTQ history. This is an area where they feel like they're not equipped with terminology. So these are places that are easy to educate your teachers, like just helping them with their confidence to be able to teach the content would be helpful. But you can also see down here from the Great Society on, with the exception of the Vietnam War, like teachers just aren't getting to the end of the semester. And it is, when I was going to when I was in high school, my high school history class only went through World War II. Today, most teachers are able to get through the civil rights movement, but that's still 70 years ago, right? And so teachers are really, really struggling for how to integrate the latter part of U.S. history. And somebody who was commenting on the American lesson plan on Blue Sky, and I'm so sorry that I can't remember their name, said, we talk about the cotton gin more than we talk about the computer, which is absolutely true. You will find standards that do not mention the computer, and 93% of teachers who took our survey said that they find the main goal, one of the main goals that they have in their history classrooms, is to make connections to the present. But if you're not being able to even mention the computer, how close to the present are you really getting when we're talking about the actual worlds that our students live in, and are growing up in? And this just kind of, these are the areas where teachers specifically said, I do not have sufficient background to be able to teach this. Okay, so you see Native America, but then again, you see 6 of the other 9 here are from post 1970. Okay. Um, Teachers reported a lot of teachers feel pressure, but they are, it's not necessarily being expressed directly in objections. So we asked teachers, how often do you face objections or criticism for the content that you teach? And only 2% told us frequently, which is something that they defined, right? But more often, way more often, 85% said once or twice or never. And that is also true in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania here, we see 84% of teachers saying once, twice, or never, that they got pushback on particular content that they were teaching. But that does not mean, and I need to emphasize this, that they weren't experiencing pressure, right? It's very hard to ask a question in the survey about, well, do you perceive that there are pressures on you from other sources? What we asked was a very direct question. And so I want to emphasize that this is not to diminish the kind of culture war atmosphere that is affecting the way that history education is being taught, particularly in Pennsylvania with its purple, purple kind of political makeup, and that people in the same districts are fighting at the school boards, right? Bucks County, of course, having been in the news extensively, and a few other counties on top of that. But like people going to the school board and complaining about what their kids are learning in their classrooms, which used to be something that happened from between teacher and parent, that the parent felt like they could approach the teacher and say their complaint. The teacher would say something back, they'd work it out, and then only then would it escalate to the school board. And what we see is that it goes directly to the school board now in most cases. Um, so and, and another example from the kind of curriculum front is generally speaking, we asked about a whole bunch of different sources. Pennsylvania was mostly in alignment with kind of the overall figures that we had there, but I would say that the exception would be Hillsdale. Which is Hillsdale College in Michigan. It is a conservative evangelical Christian institution that has a lot of homeschooling, has a homeschooling textbook that's like over 3,000 pages that they give out for free. And Hillsdale was recognized more often in Pennsylvania, but that may be kind of a marketing effect because of just the amount of money, honestly, that is being put into Pennsylvania and trying to stir up these kind of political differences. Um, but uh, but I should also say that even though teachers were saying like things come up in our classrooms, you shouldn't assume that there's an issue of disunity necessarily. Some teachers talked about that they were able to teach their students how to have civil conversations. And I want to encourage you to think about what students are not doing or what they don't do as being about a lack of skills. And how can museum educators also supplement kind of that kind of skill development, particularly for classrooms in a democratic society, right? How do we have these conversations? So to that, you know, you teachers in museums are kind of canaries in the coal mine for each other, and helping through collaboration, teachers and museum educators can help each other stay in contact or stay in touch with what is touchy subject matter, what's sensitive subject matter, and help each other teach it and present it in better ways rather than avoiding it, which is the tendency is to, I just want to avoid all of the controversy. And I want to really encourage to avoid preemptive compliance, to you know, be well reasoned in the things that you're doing and to defend them as much as you can, because if they're not getting it in these educational environments where there's, you know, extreme concern for the ethics of how we present information, other people are doing it. Right. So if you avoid it, it just means that it's going to be gotten from elsewhere. And your expertise is incredibly important in making sure that information is received in helpful ways. Um, so I'll end by saying that this project really convinced us as a team of the importance of state and local history in the classroom and state and local institutions in support of teachers. You're absolutely necessary. Um, and when it comes to history content in particular, wherever you can help teachers use local examples of national trends beyond Gettysburg, beyond Philadelphia and the founding, right? But like looking at all of those periods of US history that are in our survey and saying, okay, what do we have that could supplement them here and here and here? What do we have that could supplement the civil rights movement in Pennsylvania? What do we have that could supplement you know, a September 11th unit or a lesson plan about how September 11th was felt and experienced in Pennsylvania, right? Like making sure as students become increasingly disembodied and disengaged and disconnected from the classroom, right? Because of their minds are elsewhere. There is a lot of pressure on students and teachers right now, right? And so anything that you can do to synergize, but also grounding that student in the landscapes where they live so that they can understand themselves as the product of historical processes, because right now they feel detached from the historical processes, and whenever they see themselves in the curriculum, they start sparking to it, right? And and one of the best ways to do that is to situate them in the places where they live and work and where their families have history, right? And I also want to encourage, and this is for all museum educators, interdisciplinary lessons, particularly in elementary school, trying to get it to where, where science, math, literacy, and historical study, geography, where all of these things are kind of in the same lesson, which will maximize the attention that all of them get, and will help students kind of integrate them in the classroom. Right now, they are kind of experiencing these subject areas as siloed, and that's why history education is getting 30 minutes a week, if that. So the more you can help teachers develop integrated interdisciplinary lessons, the better. Um, and then also just professional development, but content-based professional development. So with local sources, artifacts, local sites, anything that helps teachers incorporate experiential learning. Teachers need to emerge from professional development with plug and play resources. That's what they're looking for. So anything that you can do with that time to help build those lessons together will be considered incredibly valuable and useful to the teachers that live near you. And I'm gonna stop there. And I'm so sorry that I went so long. I got a little thrown off by the PowerPoint issue, but I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Whit. This is Jeff Nichols with the
Hi.
National War Museum. Um, I thank you for this. It was great. Everything we hoped it would be. I'm also on the board of PA museums. Can you go in a little more detail? You mentioned briefly about I guess fewer teachers or few people becoming classroom teachers. Is that because of the lack of history in the classroom and kind of feeding itself, or is it just a larger issue related to more STEM and STEAM type things going on in life?
That's a great question, and it's a combination of all of these things and more, right? Exposure to history is what makes historians. It's what makes history majors. It's what makes history teachers. It takes one good teacher to make somebody. So many people that I talked to when I was talking to teachers, we were like, "Why did you get into history?" And they were like, "Well, I had a really good teacher in high school. I had a really good teacher in the sixth grade. I had a really good teacher when I went to high school or when I went to college, and I was going to major in engineering and I changed my major, right?" And people are being exposed to history less and less and less. Um, they're getting it through, there's the TikTokification, right? Of 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 history content, which is not necessarily bad. I think it should be popular and viral, right? But I think that the one of the main issues is that there's the perception that history teachers don't make money, right? And that is the worst kind of particularly when students are being raised in context where it's like you have to be able to take care of yourself, you have to have a job that you are sure that will give you employment, that you're sure will pay your bills. And I can speaking as a professional historian who, all three of my degrees are in history. There is no guarantee for getting your dream history job, and that's just a general cultural undervaluing. At the same time as that, there's this professed love for history, but there's not a lot of love for history teachers and historians.
You're preaching
So
to the choir here in the museum field. We understand
absolutely.
completely.
But this is also why it's essential to get kids exposed to history in elementary school, starting there where they can get excited about it and that they're hungry for it when it comes. There's also the yeah, I mean, there and also the abuse of teachers that the media narratives, even though like I can give you the 2%, only 2% say that they were experienced frequent objections. But the media narrative is incredibly powerful. And if you want respect, are you going to be a history teacher? Is a awful question that is very relevant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat from Doug. Um, did your study look into the intermediate units across the state? Here in Bucks County, there is a social studies coordinator and a committee made up of many of the circular specials from the variety of Bucks County districts. Should the IUs receive a copy of the report? So I did have some interaction with the intermediate units, but in general, they are kind of in this very support centered position. So they pick up the phone when they're called was generally the kind of impression that I got when we were doing this report. I think that this report could be I think that there's something in this report for everybody. So, there's something in there, like even, and I highly recommend looking at part 4 of the report, particularly if you're in a history museum and you're like, okay, I teach or I work at a Civil War museum or Civil War era museum, but like, what are teachers getting wrong, or where are the errors kind of coming from? Which I will say that most of the errors that we saw were not malicious, were not politically motivated. They were just the result of simplification and streamlining to be able to get to the end of the year. So anywhere where local history can come in, that's immediate complexity, because how local things play out are never the exact same as they play out at the national stage. But there's this feedback loop between them, right? That makes students kind of think about what are the what the relationship is. Yeah, so the intermediate units in Pennsylvania, they are we may mention them in the report, but it would be in comparison to other states where the intermediate those kind of agencies have more or less power. And an example of that would be in Texas, where they have educational service centers, ESCs, and they are responsible for their own funding. So they're literally selling materials that they're developing to the schools, and those schools are paying for and those ESCs, they specialize in certain subject areas. I think it may be the Houston area ESC that is a specialist in social studies, and so they make most of their money off of social studies content. So like they're just radically different systems. So in Pennsylvania in particular, my impression of them was more of kind of this helper category rather than to have any kind of curricular push. But I may be incorrect about that, and I'd be happy to hear more if there's more details there.
I have to apologize. I have to be on a 1 o'clock meeting, but I want to thank you. I know the IUs here have been good at coordinating stuff in Bucks County. We're
Okay,
William Penn's home. So we're a
right.
destination site when you're teaching Pennsylvania history, and we do about eight, in a good year, 10,000 school kids a year.
Okay,
So
wow.
we do a lot. But thank you, and Rusty,
Yeah.
thanks for bringing this all together. Apologies to everyone for checking out early.
Thank you, Doug.
Yep.
Thank you for your comment, Sarah. I was just reading that. And I think these kind of intermediate units or regional educational agencies, they the role that you're talking about, like organizing a conference, that's generally the most that we see from those particular units, except in the case of Texas, which is an exception in almost every way, which is the way they like it.
So the IU units in our area, when I first started here at Drakewell, they, it very much was there was no relationship until one day they reached out to us because they wanted to rent our facility to hold one of
Mm,
their Act 48 classes.
I see.
And it was after that that I'm like, well, if you're coming here to do that, just to use our facility, they didn't care about who we were. It's like, don't you know that, this is here? We're not just a room to rent. So it was really kind of opening their eyes on that. And what we found a lot happening was teachers just come here because it's here, it's cheap, it's easy to come
Hmm.
here. Um, but we have seen a huge decline in the groups coming because they don't focus on history anymore and they have
Mm,
to teach to test. As
mhm,
sad as it is, they have to teach to test. But what we're trying to put into their heads now is, I mean, I am not a science person whatsoever. I'm totally history, and I'm still grasping at the concept of how to refine oil into gasoline, you know.
mhm,
But what we tell the teachers is we can really give the basics and we can give that history behind it. And then they run with it. And now we are being invited out to do outreaches where it's like, let's show the history behind the science.
mhm,
So it's finding that niche where you can do it, you know,
mhm.
and working with partnerships and things. But yeah, it is kind of hard. And yeah.
Well, but I
I'm
hear
glad we're not
also
the
as
only
a
ones struggling.
yeah, but I also hear in there an opportunity, right? Like you saw like the IU coming to you and being like, "Hey, can we rent your room?" And you pushing and being like, "Well, we can actually do more than that." And
Right.
maybe there is if you could find a receptive ear at your local IU or your regional IU, that might be an opportunity to bring more teachers in, particularly elementary teachers again. Yeah.
Yes. The elementary is the big one. You know, and what we do find is that the older grades, it is maybe me popping in virtually to the classroom for a little bit, you know,
Hmm.
because they are doing a chemistry experiment, and then I just pop in, you know, for like 15 minutes of their class just to explain, hey, that
Hmm.
oil came from here, and that's
Right.
that. But it's getting us out there. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
yep.
Well, we are bumping up on an hour here. So I want to make sure that everyone knows we appreciate your coming today and to please keep an eye out for some more of these types of programs. Whit, thank you very much. That was really great. I learned a lot. Here in the chat, you can see Whit has shared her email address if you have questions that you would like to follow up one-on-one with her. Um, and if
Absolutely.
there, do you have any final remarks, Whit, before we wrap it up?
Well, I just wanted to offer if you have like if you're curious about if you're looking at the report and you say, well, I wonder on this particular question, how does Pennsylvania fit in? I have that data, and please feel free to send me a question and say, I kind of want to know more about, how Pennsylvania fits into this particular context or what have you. I'm here to be a resource. I also, any of your museums or if you have teachers that you want to partner with the AHA and you'd like me to speak to them about particular content or the whole report or what have you, I'm available and can be scheduled. So I just want to emphasize that I'm incredibly grateful to be here. I'm incredibly grateful for this opportunity. Excited to get any feedback or any compliments or critiques that you have as I continue to seek more museum educators to talk to. Thank you. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, everybody. We'll hope to see all of you soon. We appreciate your being with us.
But I wanted to say